and clubs and other informal daily gatherings like people playing on the street, for instance. And I focus on the central part of the city, which is inside the third ring of the city, which covers really the traditional city and also part of the modern urban environment. And at first I map them and superimpose them with the housing areas. And then I divided this research area into different neighborhoods based on the road capacity, the traffic, the public transport, and also use space syntax technique as a kind of indication to divide it into blocks. As a result, there are 225 blocks being started. And then I start to study the internal spatial condition and the external spatial conditions for the emergence of this local centrality. For this map, I calculate for each block the exit number divided by the number of streets. So this map could show a kind of internalness or introvertedness of each block. When you have less number of exit and a large number of streets, I could say, okay, this block is more like a small world on its own, right? It's more like the kind of, for instance, this kind of Li Fang in Chang'an city that we had before. And on this lower part, I classify this kind of this number, and the darker color here means a kind of space that's more open. The thinner color, the lighter color means when it's more closed, and the orange bar here shows the kind of possibility that this kind of neighborhood contains or support a local center. As we can see here, there is a kind of tendency that more open environment have less possibility to support a local center. And similarly, I use min-dex, that's a kind of a calculation based on space syntax, to calculate the min-dex of each block. But here, the darker color shows more complex internal structures. So the dark neighborhoods, there's more street and they have a kind of more complex, it's more like a labyrinth form. And in this sense, again, the result shows a kind of tendency that more complex internal structures have better possibilities to hold local scale centrality. And here I write a Chinese poem. It says, if the wine is good, it does not matter how deep it is located. But does it result really support this poem? And when I look at the external spatial conditions, and for instance on this map, I show the number of exit per block. So the dark neighborhoods have more exit, and but the tendency is not very clear. And when I divided this data, when I gave weight to different kind of exit, for instance, when you have an exit open to a higher level street, it could, for instance, you could give a kind of different weight, like 3 times this exit open to higher level street equals to 3 exit open to lower level street. When I use this rule, the tendency becomes even more clear. Immediately, it looks like the type of blocks which are better connected with outside have better potential to support local centralities. So there was kind of seemingly contradiction results coming out of this study, but actually I would like to show that this is what's interface logic about. So you got a kind of area that's better connected in the city, but also it has a better internal structures. Then this type of neighborhood has the best potential to control to support a kind of inner neighborhooded based street life. So here I'm trying to make a detailed study on the configuration of this interface. Because previous study is more on a kind of statistic level. So this is I'm trying to go into a kind of spatial level to see how this configuration is being actualized inside each block. What this interface logic really is. And first I divided based on the mean depth of the urban block and the actual urban housing typologies, I divided these 200 neighborhoods into four typologies. The first one is the labyrinth structure. It's a very complex internal structure. And the second is a little bit clearer, a little bit easier than the previous one. It's more like a kind of grid, but sometimes it's still not very simple grid structure. The third type C, is a kind of traditional hutong structure, which you can see later. It's really a kind of very orthogonal grid structure. It's very clear form. And the fourth type is called gated community, which represent a kind of post-war development. It's like a housing area, but more or less closed. So in that type of block, there's very limited number of streets can be used by outsiders. So this is the first type, the labyrinth structure. And we can see that on the first row is the type of urban functions. So the black color represents a kind of local-based function. And the second row is the space syntax calculation of the individual block. So the black lines are those streets better connected inside the block. And the third row represents a kind of penetratability of the block. So this lines shows the border condition. So the thick lines represent a higher level of street outside, and these small dashed lines represent the kind of visibility line from the outside. And as we can see, because this internal structure are mostly very complex, so there are, in most cases, the inner part are empty, but also because the street somehow became more introverted in terms of its form. So there are two tendencies. On the one hand, in this type of blocks, the local centers tend to locate really in the inside the block, and other possibility is that it locates one step away from the outside as a kind of entrance condition to outside. And for this type, the same logic actually still applies. So on the one hand, the local centers tend to locate in very centralized local internal street. On the other hand, it's also trying to be at least visible from outside. And the third one is representing the hutong structure, representing a kind of typical Beijing fabric, which has this kind of east-west street, densely built, and very limited number of north-south street. The result shows that this kind of north-south street, although sometimes it's quite short, but it still have a good capacity to gather the inner movement of this block. So therefore, it became a kind of catalyst for the emergence of the local centrality. And one interesting exception is actually this block, the block number 55. Actually, because the data was collected on 2005, actually before this street is full of local shops, but now because this border is being upgraded into kind of urban highway, and there's recently a lot of fashion shops, high-level shops occupy this space. Now it's mainly used for tourists. That's why it's not highlighted for local centralities.